So today we're going to do a before and after video of my old homemade red gum snare drum, before in its current state and after I true up the bearing edges. Let's check it out. So this snare drum I made about 8 years ago from some red gum that was cut down from a tree on my grandfather's block. And basically what I did is I got a carpenter to cut the staves for me, so it's a stave construction. And if I hold the drum up, hopefully you can see what that looks like on the inside. So I got a carpenter to cut the staves for me, and then I did everything by hand. I glued it up by hand, I filed down the outside to make it round all by hand. I cut the bearing edges with the file as well, and then finished them with sandpaper. And then finally I gave the outside a nice gloss finish. Put some tube lugs on it, a trick throw off, and some skins, and it seemed to work okay. But what started to happen is, because the timber was quite wet and not cured properly, is it started to go out of round. And so it ended up being about 1 centimeter shorter in one diameter than the other. And I think it started to affect the sound, and I just stopped using it. And I hadn't pulled it out for about 5 years. And so I took the skins off it the other day and started to check it out, and it seems that it's come back into shape. And I did some measurements, and it's only about 2 millimeters difference in diameter from across one way to across the other way. But then I was checking out the bearing edges on the kitchen bench on some flat stone, and I worked out that there was a bit of variation in the bearing edges by about 2 millimeters. So they weren't perfectly flat. And so what I decided to do is pick up some new materials. So I've got a new snare side head for it and some new snares, because I don't have any spares laying around. And what we're going to do is a before and after test. So see how it sounds like now with the bearing edges slightly out of round, and I'll show you what that looks like. Then I'll true them up, put the same skin and the snare wires back on, tune it up to the same tuning, and see what it sounds like. So to tune up the bearing edges, I've got a flat piece of stone that's an offcut from a kitchen bench, and I'm going to glue some sandpaper sheets down onto it using 80 grit and using some good old liquid nails, and that'll create a nice flat sanding surface for me to sand the edges down and make sure that they're true flat. And I'll take you along the way. So I'll show you what I'm going to do to glue the sandpaper down, I'll show you how I true up the edges, and then I'll do some recordings before and after, so we get to see how much of an effect those 2 millimeters difference in the bearing edge has on the sound. Let's get into it. All right, so in this setup, I've got the snare resting on this piece of stone, which is my guide for true flat. And I've got a torch on the inside, just this one. And that torch is shining light underneath the edge of the shell, and basically as we turn the shell, what we'll see is where any light is escaping under the shell between the bearing edge and the stone, the greater the amount of light, the bigger the gap between the stone and the bearing edge. So we'll be able to detect which sections of the bearing edge are not true flat. So if I gently spin this around, you'll see the amount of light that is being passed underneath the shell is changing. So right there's a huge amount of light coming through, and that's because there's quite a significant gap between the stone and the shell. Now less light, so this side's pretty good. And this side also has quite a significant gap. Cool, and we're back to the other side again. So now if you flip it over, and let's check the snare side. So that first side was the batter side. Now let's check the snare side. So here you can see the snare beds, and it's pretty cool. The light kind of mirrors the shape of the edge cut, and so you can see that's a nice round snare bed. Pretty sharp. It's not a wide snare bed. It's only about 8 to 10 centimeters wide. there's quite a gap on this side. You can see as I rock the shell, the edge, you see as I rock the shell, the amount of light coming through that edge changes. So that means the shell is too deep on the edges here because I'm able to rock it across this front to back axis. You can see this little cut in here. That's because this stave has a bit of a lip that's formed between this and the stave next to it. So that needs to be flattened out. Then coming across to the other snare bed. And there you go, you can see quite a significant rock there as well. And there. And then back to the first snare bed. So as you can see from that, the edges are quite uneven, and what we're going to do is bring it across to this side where I've glued the sandpaper down and start flattening it out. Cool, so I just gave the stone a bit of a clean with metho because it was dusty. We want to make sure the sandpaper sticks as good as possible. So here we have some 80 grit timber sandpaper, 5 sheets. 4 should hopefully be enough. Basically, we're just going to arrange them in a pattern like this and glue them down next to each other so that we have a nice flat sanding surface to true up the bearing edges. Cool, should be pretty easy. So I'm going to use some liquid nails and this plunger gun or whatever you call it to put liquid nails on the back of this and stick it to the tile. So we're going to start with the snare bed side first, and basically what we're going to do is place the shell on the sandpaper here and just gently, without applying any pressure, just the weight of the shell, turn the shell like this and then back the other way. And what this will do is it will start to sand the bearing edge down and make it more even. So because this is a true flat surface, basically any of the bearing edge that is protruding past the flatter parts or the shallower parts is going to be sanded down first, leaving us with a nice true surface. So if we keep sanding a little bit, what we should find is the sections that are higher have been sanded down more. So can we see this on the camera? So our snare bed is here. We can see this side has been sanded down quite significantly, and same with the opposite snare bed and the bearing edge next to it. And these sides were the axis that were creating the rock before on the snare side. And so they've been sanded down the most, which is great. This means that this surface is working. We're going to end up with a nice flat bearing edge. So we'll keep going until I think we start to see all points of the bearing edge have been touched by the sandpaper. So this side hasn't been touched yet, so let's keep going for a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the shell back over on the flat stone over here, and we're going to test the edges to see if we have any light coming underneath. Okay, starting with the snare side again, let's have a look. All right, there's the snare bed.
rest of the shell, or the bearing edge, is looking very, very flat. I don't see any light poking through besides the snare bed, which is a really good sign. Let's check the batter side. Okay, still a bit of light there. Bit of light here as well. So I'm going to give the batter side a bit more of a sand. So let's check the batter side one more time. I've just spent some time sanding it down. And as you can see, this is looking real nice. Pretty much flat. All right, so now that we have the bearing edge flattened, what's happened is we've got some flatter spots where the higher points were. And then we've got the sharper bearing edge where the original edge was, and that would have been the lower point. So they didn't get sanded down as much. So now what we have to do is just make these flatter spots sharper again. So the way that I'm going to do that is use this little mortar and pestle piece and wrap some 80 grit sandpaper around it, and start by just sanding that edge on the inside until we reach a nice sharp edge. And that's not going to take too long with 80 grit. And then we'll go around and finish it with 120 grit. So now I've gone around the edges with this thing, with the sandpaper, to make sure we maintain the shape of the edge. What I'm going to do next is just go around with a sanding block and just delicately make sure we develop that nice sharp corner. So I'll go around the outside and then around the inside. Both with 80 and then 120 grit.
So basically, once I finished sanding down the bearing edges, I checked them one more time to make sure that they were still nice and flat. And then it was time to put the hardware back on. So I started putting the hardware back on. I actually ran into an issue where the snare butt mounting bolts were too far in, and so it wouldn't let me close the snare butt properly. Sorted that out, and I tuned the drum up. I had a drum that was my reference tune, and so I was able to check the tune of the drum against that, and I just tuned by ear, and I also used a little tool in Logic Pro to help me make sure I was hitting the right fundamental note, so I could get consistency between the before and the after test. So I'm actually really stoked with the outcome of this test. I think it's done two things to the drum. It's changed the nature of the overtones and made them more complex. So although those two clips sound like the drum's tuned differently, the fundamental is actually tuned identically, but the changes in the complexity of the overtones, which the bearing edge has obviously had an effect on, to make them sound much more rich, and it's lowered the implied pitch of them, which is really cool. And secondly, it's extended the sustain and the depth of that fundamental. It sounds a lot more thwacky and punchy now, and it's much more fun to play. So I'm really excited by the result, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this little A/B test and experiment as well.